Hello all, in today's video I will show you how to highlight an object in the game world using your character. In this tutorial I'm going to show you some logic that communicates between blueprints using your player character, components, and interfaces. Let's jump in. We'll start by creating a series of assets in our content drawer. In a new folder, I will right click and I will create first a material. I'll call this m_highlight material. I will create a blueprint interface under blueprint interface. I will call this BPI_highlight material. And I will create a blueprint. I will right click and say new blueprint class of type actor. And I will call this BP_highlighted world object. We'll start by adding some logic to our highlighted material. I'll open up and I will start by pressing 3 on my keyboard and left clicking in my graph to create a float 3. Or a vector 3. I can also right click and say vector 3, which is the same thing. I will right click and say convert to parameter. I will call this base color. I'll drag this pen into my base color. I'll do the same again, pressing 3 and left clicking. Right clicking, saying convert to parameter. I will call this highlight color. I will drag this out to create a multiply. Below, I will right click and type Fresnel. This is what we'll use to give us our highlighted edge. I will drag off here and say cheap contrast. I'll press S on my keyboard and left click to create a scalar parameter, which I will call contrast value. I will drag this in here and I will first set a value of 0.05. And I'm going to set the exponent in my Fresnel to 15. I'll move this over. I'm going to drag this and create another multiply. And I will multiply this result by this value. And I'll press S on my keyboard and left click to create another scalar parameter. I will call this emissive intensity. I will drag this in here and then drag this into my emissive. So we'll set some default values. I'll make my base color a sort of gray value so we can see that reflected here. And I'll make my highlight value a red value. So we don't see anything yet, and that's because our emissive intensity is 0. Once we set this to 1, we'll then see a glow around our material preview in the viewport. And we can see this on different shapes, how this behaves. So we'll see obviously it behaves differently on a cube. But we will be able to change this contrast value, which will change how that is reflected on this object. So we'll test that in our materials in a moment, but this is our base logic. So I will save this and we'll go back to our assets. Next, I'll go into my blueprint interface. I'll double click and I'm going to create one function. So it's already created one up here, and I'm going to call this set highlight status. The importance of the blueprint interface is that I could implement this functionality onto a variety of different blueprint types and create different functions based, around similar logic, but allow my character to communicate with multiple blueprints. And we'll show you that in just a moment. So next what we're going to do is we're going to add some functionality onto our player character. So I'm going to find my third person character in my content drawer. It's called BP third person character because we're using the template. So I'll double click to open this up. And what's going to happen is when we right click, it's going to line trace forward. And when we release, it will stop tracing and testing whatever we're looking at. So in order to add that functionality, first we'll right click and I'm going to type right mouse button, which will give us the mouse event. And now we need to do something when we click. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to embed this functionality into a component on the character. So I'm going to add a component in the top left up here. I'll say add, and I'm going to click the very top option, which is new blueprint script component. I'm going to create an actor component. I'll hit next, and I'll call this BPC underscore player highlight or player camera info. And in theory, I could house a bunch of different information about how I operate the camera on this blueprint. So I'll create the blueprint class, and it has now added that to my player's character. So it automatically is going to open that up for me. And this is where I can add that functionality. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my character, and where we added this right mouse button event, this is where we're going to feed information into. So on our player camera info, let's first just create one variable, and we'll call this is zoomed. And we'll set it, make sure it's false by default. But what we'll do is we'll grab our component. We're going to drag this onto our graph. And I'm going to now say set is zoomed, which is the variable we just created. And when pressed, we will set it to true. So when we press right mouse button down, we're going to zoom in. And when we release, it's going to zoom out automatically. So I'm going to make sure that I have the false Boolean set here, and then our component pulled into this target. So I'm going to drag a comment around this by pressing C, and I'm going to say zoom on right mouse button event. So now I'm going to go into my component I just created, the camera info, and we're going to respond there. So first, on event begin play, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cache the reference to my character and its camera. So I'm going to pull off here, and I'm actually going to say get owner. I'm going to pull off here and say cast to character. I'm going to drag in here. And by casting, I'm basically just testing, is the actor that I'm attached to, my owner, is it a character? We already kind of know this is true in this situation, but we're going to say get component by class. And again, we could cast to a third person character, but I'm just going to do it this way. And we're going to get a component of type camera. And we want a camera component. And I'm going to promote this to a variable by dragging off here. And I'll call this on the left player camera reference. Set this here. And I'm going to pull off here and say get field of view. And I will promote this to a variable. And I will say cached field of view. So we always know that this is basically the default value. I'll compile, I'll save. And I'm going to just drag a comment around this by pressing C after I select and saying cache player camera. And so in this situation, we're actually going to do this logic on event tick. A lot of times you want to be more conservative about how you use event tick. However, the player is sort of one of the primary blueprints that you'll be using. So it should really have the authority to, do more performance intensive behaviors. This is not really performance intensive, but in this situation, we'll use event tick. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically every frame sort of test the value of what's in front of us. So we're going to start by just dragging off our is zoomed right here. And we're going to right click and say select float. And we're going to drag our is zoomed into the pick A. And basically what we need to do is pick between a current field of view and what is our goal field of view. So we don't have a goal yet, but we do have a cached field of view. So this is sort of our default. And I'll press Control D to duplicate this. And I'll say zoomed field of view. And I'm going to set this to 65 for now. By default, this cached is going to be 90 on the player character, which you can see if you go to the camera, to the follow camera, and search field of view. We'll see that it's 90. So I'm going to set my zoomed value over here in the details panel as 65. And Now we're going to use our zoom. So we're going to pull this out and say get. We're going to get our cached and we'll say get. And I'm going to drag the cached into the B value and the zoomed into the A. So basically we're saying if we are zooming, which means we've right-clicked, it means we want to zoom, we're going to interpolate to this value. So how are we going to do that? We'll drag off here and say f interp to, and this is using an interpolate function. And so we're actually going to drag this using control click into the target. And then we're going to pull off current and say promote to variable and say current field of view. We'll drag this value and we'll say set current field of view. We're going to drag our event tick into this set. So this is the start of our function. Now we'll pull off and we're going to grab our player camera reference. We'll say get. We're going to drag off here and say set field of view. We're going to drag in here and we'll drag this float into here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pull off and say branch. And I've done a B and left mouse click on the keyboard, which basically just quick populates a branch, or you can right click and say branch. And we're going to test is zoomed. And so we're only going to execute a line trace forward from the player's camera if we are trying to zoom. So now what we're going to do is we'll pull off of true and say if we are tracing or if we are zooming, line trace by channel. We're going to get the player's camera reference. We'll pull off and say get. I will pull off and I will say get world location. I will pull off and I will say get forward vector. I will multiply this forward vector by a float. So I'm going to say vector or float to vector. And this float right here, we can actually just set as a variable, and this will be the distance to trace. So this is the distance out in front of the player's camera that we will test. So I'm going to say this is 1,000 units. And then we will add the location to the forward vector, which is basically tracing out forward in front of the player's camera in the direction of its forward vector. We're going to add it here. This is going to be our end vector, and then the world location to begin with is going to be our start vector. So this is our forward trace logic. Off of the out hit, I'm going to pull off and I'll say break hit result. I'm going to drop this down here. I'm going to pull off hit actor and say set highlight status, which is going to be the function that we just created before. I'm going to drag this in here. And then we'll review just so we understand what's happening here. So we created this blueprint interface, which is the highlight material, and we created this event called set highlight status. And when we trace forward from the player's camera, we're doing this line trace. We're testing whatever we just hit with that line trace. And then so we take that actor and we say, if you have this functionality, do this event. So if you look at that message, it says this does nothing if the target does not implement the required interface. So no harm if it doesn't, but if it does and it's one of our object types that implements it, it'll do the functionality that is called for in that blueprint. So I'm going to compile this and I'll save this. I'm going to add a comment around this and I'll just say trace on tick. Save again. And now we're going to add the functionality in our highlighted object blueprint. So I'm going to browse back to this using the magnifying glass, my interface. So we're going to find our BP underscore highlighted object that we created at the beginning. I'm going to double click. And first we're going to implement our interface. So under our class settings in the details panel on the right, we'll see this drop down that says implemented interfaces. I'm going to click add, and then I'm going to type the name of our interface, which is BPI underscore highlight material, and I'll select it. And I will compile. I'm going to make sure that I've also compiled and saved our blueprint interface. And once we've done that, we'll see that on the left here, we'll now have this interfaces dropdown with the event that we've created, which is set highlight status. So in our event graph, I'm going to right click and I'll say implement event. It'll pop up and create an event for us. And this is where we're going to execute our logic for the blueprint. So I'm going to create first just a variable. So I'm going to hit this plus sign down here. I'm going to say active. And I'm going to pull off here and say set active. And basically when we've called from our character and said set highlight status, we're going to set it to active here. And we'll make sure that by default, active is set to false. And then we're going to say do once. And we're going to add a component in the top left. And we'll just add a sphere. And we're going to set our material that we've created. So I'm going to browse back here, get our highlight material. And I'm going to, in our blueprint, I'm going to set that as the base material. So I'm going to select this little gray arrow here, which is going to set it to the default. It's going to just pop it in from our content drawer when it's selected. And so in the beginning, we're going to create a material instance, a dynamic material instance of this. So I'll say get my sphere. I will say get material. And in this situation, we know there's only one material, so we're not going to do a for each loop and cache the materials in an array. We're just going to do the first material index. So I'll promote this here to a variable, and I'll say cached standard material. So this is our base level with no highlight. And then from that, we're going to create a dynamic material instance. And I'll actually just do it. Like sometimes we can either do that way or just like this, but I know what results I'm looking for in this situation. So I'm going to say create dynamic material instance. And the target is the sphere. And I'm going to then promote this to a variable. And so I'll say dynamic material reference. Or I'll just dynamic material reference is great. And then on this, I'm going to set scalar parameter value. So we're going to turn the highlight on. And we need to make sure that we have the on our material. So if I browse back to it here, I'm going to open it up and we want to make sure we have the exact name of this scalar parameter we've created, which is emissive intensity. And so I'm going to set, I've just Control-C'd on my keyboard and I'm going to paste it in here. You can type it out, but just make sure it's exactly the same. We're going to set this value to 1. So I'll compile and I'll save. And so then after we've created the material, which we're only going to do one time, which is why we've done this do once, we're actually going to do something else. So I'm going to create a sequence node, which I've done S on my keyboard and left mouse click, which creates it, or right click and type sequence. So I'm going to drag the then into here. And then I will say, get my sphere. And I'm going to get my dynamic material reference. And I'll say get. On my sphere, I'll say set material. I'll drag the then one into here. I'm going to drag my material reference into material. And I'm actually then going to set timer by event. So basically what I'm going to do is this will allow me to say, if I don't receive this event for a period of time, we're going to reset the material. So I'm going to pull off here and say create event. And I'm going to say 0.1 seconds. And then I'm going to hit select function. And I'll go down to create a matching event. And I will say reset material. And then I will say for my sphere, I'm actually going to copy the set material on the sphere using Control-C. I'll paste it down here. I'm going to drag in this pin. And then I'm going to use my cached standard material. So I'll drag off onto my graph and say get cached standard material. Dragging it in here. Let's add some comments and then review what we've done. So I'll create a comment around this, say reset material. I'm gonna grab this and I'll say create dynamic material. And then I will also grab this and I'll just say DPI event call from player character camera component. And that is good for now. So in theory, what you'd actually probably want to do is test if the material, on this tick, because this is going to get called on tick for now, we'd want to test, is the material in this sphere already equal to this? And if so, don't set the material. But for right now, we're fine. So let's drag some of our blueprint into the map and test this out. All right, now let's test this out as we have it. I'll drag some of my blueprint into the environment and we'll talk about what we notice. So I'll drag 4 copies in. I'm going to right click, say play from here. When I right click, I'll notice that it immediately zooms. And so now we'll talk about how we can fix this. But we see that our objects highlight as we zoom in and pan towards them, and the highlight turns away as we stop looking at it directly. So let's go to our camera info blueprint. And first we're going to change our interp speed. Let's make this 2. And what we also want to do is we want to set our current field of view to 0, or to our cache field of view right at the beginning. So let's grab our current field of view from up here, say set, drag this in here, I'll compile. So now I'll right click, say play from here, and we notice nothing happens. So let's make sure that we have a delta time of 0.1, and we'll start to notice a difference. So you can change the delta time. This is basically going to be the time since last tick. If you do something like 0.01, that is fine as well. But it's basically just going to sort of slow that down. And so maybe that's what you want, but I'll allow you to experiment and choose what you want. And so now let's take our highlighted material and we'll create some variations of that blueprint. So I'll right click and say create material instance, and I'll call this _green material. And I'll open this up and we can change now our base color and our highlight color. So maybe we want a sort of bluish base, and I'm going to change my red highlight to a green highlight. We can preview if we set our emissive intensity to 1. I'm going to make sure it's back to 0 for begin play. So I'll hit save. I'm going to select this blueprint here. I'll grab my sphere. I'm going to, because it's already selected my content drawer, use my little gray arrow here to plop that in. You can see the slight color change. It's very subtle. And I will plop it in here as well, just so we can see that it's different. I'm going to make sure it's dramatically different so that we can see the difference in our viewport. So now we can see it. And when I right click, I'll hit play from here. And when I zoom, I'm going to see a red highlight on this, and I'll see a green highlight on this. This is how you could differentiate things like damage, health, ammo, whatever it is. And that is going to be all for today's tutorial. I hope you all enjoyed learning about some of these concepts that should be fundamental to the way you use blueprints. And as always, stay tuned for more Unreal Engine 5 tutorials and content. Thanks all.